Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Two Friends Film Podcast. My name is Brian, and I'm back here with Fowler. Say hello.
It's great to be here.
Perfect. And today we're going to be talking about one of my personal favorites, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Take it away, Fowler, with the summary before we get started here.
Sure. So what Brian and I have realized is that we both have a tendency to love complicated films. We had this problem with Rashomon. Brian and I spent some time trying to shorten the summary, and it was very difficult because a lot happens in this film. But we'll break it down. So, Clem and Joel are this couple who have a really powerful, influential relationship that ends in a really messy breakup. Joel learns that Clem has used this experimental procedure to erase all of her memories of him in order to move on, and Joel decides to do so as well because he's pretty fucked up after the relationship. Uh, the operation to remove Clem from his mind, it occurs in Joel's house at night while he's asleep. There's Dr. Howard, the head technician, Mary, who's Howard's secretary, Patrick, who's a very creepy technician that helps Howard and is dating Clem, and then Stan, who's a more normal but still creepy technician who's dating Mary. And so the way the operation works is Joel is sleeping, but while he's sleeping, he's processing all of his memories, not only of Clem, but really his entire life. And he's sort of self-aware as the operation is occurring, and like different things and people within his memories disappear. But over time, he decides that erasing Clem is a mistake when he kind of relives their relationship, and he decides to basically try and wake up and preserve his memories. And so, and he creates kind of a mental version of Clem who attempts to help him do this, but it doesn't work. Joel fails, and the operation is successful, and he loses all of his memories of Clem. As a B plot during the operation, Mary makes kind of a sexual move on Howard and learns that basically she did so before. They kind of had this fucked up relationship. It didn't work out, and then she also had the operation done to remove Howard. Patrick, the creepy technician, he attempts to basically steal Joel's diary and gifts from his house and use them to seduce Clem. And despite the fact, basically, he does everything that Joel did and says everything Joel said, she still rejects him. And then in the morning, after the operation is successful, Mary quits working for Howard, and she mails all of his files to all of his former patients so that they know, who they've had erased in their memories and for what reason. Clem and Joel both receive those files. They listen to them and understand that the relationship failed. And it failed so brutally that they had this operation to erase each other from their minds. But they still decide to basically get back together and try it again. And that's the cliff notes of Eternal Sunshine.
Yeah, it's one of those plots that's like very, and we'll talk about this as well because the framing is kind of a present and then moving into the past and then back to the present sort of time frame there. So it gets a little convoluted, and the summary that's the nuts and the bolts of it. But in
There
terms,
are other films that we've done where we've done much more sort of short summaries. And I think that was more possible because we were only talking about very specific parts of the film, but we're really going to talk about pretty much every element of Eternal Sunshine. So we really had to break it down. We had to explain all the characters. We had to explain all of the plot lines because this is a really fantastic film. I had never seen it before. It's one of Brian's favorites, and I think this is literally one of the best films I've ever seen. It was unbelievable how good it was.
yeah, it was. I'm really glad that you enjoyed it too, because part of me was going into it being like, "Damn, is Fowler actually gonna enjoy this shit, or is he gonna be really disappointed with it?" Um, so yeah, I'm really glad that we both like kind of enjoyed the experience there. So
Yeah, I will say it has so. Um, Eternal Sunshine has an unbelievable plot. Like, it's just very clever, it's very dynamic. You never really know what's happening. And sort of the twists and turns is like everyone in the operation and Joel and Clem as they kind of reveal their own character flaws and you go into their memories and you go into their insecurities. I mean, it's just masterful. It's one of those films where um, you never know what's really going to happen. And I was surprised at a bunch of parts of the film. I was really surprised by um, the different flaws each of the people doing the operation has, the way they were tied to each other, the way they were unhealthy with each other. I was really surprised by Mary giving the tapes to everyone at the end of the film. I was really surprised by some of the memories that Joel goes through and the way that the film connects them. I really, this is not a predictable film at all. It was a nail biter the whole time.
Yeah, and it's one of those films that when we went back, and we'll get more into the meat and potatoes of this here in a second, but it's one of those films that we went through and we couldn't really find like a discernible weakness to really talk about. The whole the acting was great, the direction was great, writing was great, musical score was fantastic. Visually, it was a stunning and striking film. There's a lot of things to like about this film, and there are a lot of things I love about this film in particular. But actually, we're gonna transition, and we're gonna talk here about the surprising and unique plot. So, like, this is about my, I think, third or fourth time watching through this film entirely. Um, what is something, as a first time viewer yourself, Fowler? What is something that like really stuck out to you with this film in particular?
One of the things that really blew me away with Eternal Sunshine is um, I feel like this is true with romances in particular. Like they tend to have pretty weak supporting cast because the emphasis is on the two love interests, obviously. And it's really, really difficult to have a film with a large ensemble. And this is a film that has a large ensemble. You've got Clem, you've got Joel, you've got all of the members of the operation Mary, Howard, Patrick, and Stan. And maybe besides the exception of Stan, who's really never flushed out, um, all of the characters are really well developed. They all have their own real character arc. There are sort of twists about who they really are as human beings and what their faults are, and like the ways that they have wronged each other and are toxic to each other. And I can't think of the last time I've watched a film that had this big a cast and did such a masterful job of having really everyone in the cast shine, everyone in the cast be super unique, and everyone in the cast having kind of this interesting, emotionally cathartic kind of character journey where they kind of changed as people.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that too, because like I feel like with a lot of because this film would be considered in the indie sort of genre. I feel like with a lot of indie movies, they have this ability to storytell and make things that much more impactful as it relates to that storytelling ability,
Mm.
and it's really on full showcase here. I mean, the plot itself is one that I think other films have tried to touch memory and sort of dreams, things like Inception that actually came after this film, tried it, and
It
I
was a
think,
Wars film on like every metric, I think.
yeah, I think objectively it's like not even close to like capturing this, and it's a much higher budget, much bigger production, but I think with a film like this, there are so many scenes, so many plot points that I could point to and be like it's one of those films where you could watch it several times and just pick up new snippets of information or new little details that you didn't really pick up on the first time that you're coming to now. Um, One of my favorite things about it is too, and we'll talk about this a little bit, is the blending of elements, right? Like when we talk about the plot, right? One of my favorite little notes about it is there's a scene where Joel is talking about Clem, And at this point in the film, Clem has forgotten who Joel is, right? And Joel
Mm.
isn't aware of that. So he goes into the bookstore, uh, and he's like trying to interact with Clem, and Clem just blows him off, and he takes it as her basically like as like a fuck you to him instead of
Mhm.
genuinely not remembering him. And my favorite thing is uh, Joel, who's played by Jim Carrey, goes through like the library, right? And the lights go off in it, and then he comes through this hallway, which is revealed to be the house of his friends who tell him what Clem has done, and that they received this letter to like basically not give him the information so that he's
Mm.
not like destroyed by it. And it's a really striking shot, and like if you go and watch the film, which I highly recommend, go out and check it out. That shot in particular is striking to me. Another thing I really love is later in the film, when there's a scene where he's beating a dead pigeon with like a hammer, right? And
Mhm.
the transitions in this dream sequence of him going from like holding Clem's hand as like their two kids like in this little thing, and then um it transitioning between that and them as grown adults. It's so incredible to me because like there's a little detail at the beginning where he keeps a photo of like Clem as a child. And so when she's in that dream, it's just like him remembering it and being like, I wish, we knew each other when we were young. And it's such a, it's a very specific thing, but it's something that stuck with me. Um, I guess
Yeah, this is certainly an unbelievably powerful film emotionally. I mean, it um it perfectly captures like falling in love and kind of the awkwardness of intimacy, but how like powerful and vulnerable it is. And then it also really captures like messy breakups and grief, the viciousness, the rawness, the ugliness, the spitefulness,
mhm,
and then the desperation of Joel realizing how important Clem is in his life and his kind of attempt to like save his memories and keep her in his brain, and then the emotional journeys of like the operation team. I mean, it's attempting so many different emotional moments of just a wide spectrum of feelings, and it really does a great job. Um I can't think of any point in the film where it really tries to make you feel a thing, and it doesn't succeed. And I think this is a film, like we were talking, I think, of Arrival, about how difficult it is to have that balance of cerebral and emotional, and kind of like a thinking sci-fi film. And Eternal Sunshine does a masterful job. I mean, it is a really smart film. It's a very interesting film thematically. It's also just really authentically kind of emotional as well.
yeah, it's one of those ones where I mean, there's so many moments. Like I'm a big crier when it comes to films, so like I was definitely broken up at the very end of it, and there's a lot of scenes in it where it's just beautifully played out. I mean, that ending sequence in the house where Joel is like, I have no memory of this event, this like he left Clementine in this house they broke into because he got nervous and scared, so he just journeyed off. And Clem, a manifest or a sort of figment of his own memory and imagination of her, basically is like, well, what if you stayed? Like, let's have this moment in your mind where you stay with me. Um, and it's just so interesting to, I guess what's interesting for me is the thought of new memories being created while memories are also being erased, right? Like,
Yeah, we'll get into that with themes, but I thought that
yeah,
was really interesting too.
yeah, yeah.
I think as we're talking about these scenes, like you've talked a little bit about how good the camera work is and the imagery.
Hmm.
A lot of it is also the acting and writing in this is unbelievable. Like I think it's Kaufman, right, who wrote the script.
Yeah, Charlie
The
Kaufman.
writing is unbelievable in
Hmm.
how like real it feels,
Yeah,
and like little awkward elements of it, the stammering, the pausing,
yeah.
the little intricacies, and the way
It's
that like kind of vulnerability and love
yeah,
is kind of brought up. It feels very human and very real. And then the other thing about it is good script, but also fantastic acting. I
yeah,
mean, really, everyone in this film does a great job. I was amazed by Kate Winslet. She's a
yeah.
chameleon in this film. She's
No,
so powerful.
it was so interesting that you mentioned the Kate Winslet thing too, because fun fact for the little audience members, like when we watch these things together, so we're watching it, and Fowler just like is talking to me, and he's like, "Who is that actress?" And I'm like, "Think Titanic," and then he was like, "No fucking way, that's Kate Winslet." Like,
She's always so like put together and dignified and
yeah,
elegant, and in this film she's like rocking the dyed hair, she's got the obvious mental illness and like mood swings, and she's just dressed up like a fucking grimy like 80s like punk rocker,
it's
and she doesn't have any of that like elegance. Like she's just a very kind of tomboyish figure, and I in a million years would never have guessed it was her.
no, but she plays it so fucking well too, and Jim Carrey plays this like, like it's so interesting to see the like worst and best elements brought out between these two characters and their relationship, right? Like in these dream sequences you see snippets of their relationships, the ups and the downs, the monotony of it too. Even there's a scene where all it is just them eating from their favorite Chinese restaurant, right? And that's
Mhm.
like the memory that was taken. So it's interesting to see like how even those mundane moments are portrayed in the film, right? Like, because that's what a lot of relationships are. They're not always like these high up and downs. There's a lot of times where it's just this sort of middle ground neutrality, right?
I
Uh,
totally agree. I think there's two things that make the immersion in this film really good.
mhm,
One is the characters are very real. Like their issues are like very relatable. Their insecurities and flaws are super relatable. Like that element, like they just feel like people you've met in your life.
yeah,
And then the other element is in particular with Clem and Joel, like you totally understand watching the film why they were both crazy about each other and why they were so important in each other's lives and so formative, and you also simultaneously understand watching the film like why their breakup was inevitable and why it was just so incredibly brutal and ugly. And I think that that requires a real level of subtlety from both the actors and the script to simultaneously like see and believe in their love and also see and believe like the destruction of their love.
yeah, and it's so interesting to see a Jim Carrey in these like very serious roles too, because like he's a fantastic actor. I mean, we put this on the list, but we haven't seen it yet. The Truman Show, right? Which is another one that's sort of existential, very. I don't think Kaufman did that one. He might have worked on it in some way, but I'm not sure because it deals with a lot of themes that Kaufman also deals with in his work. But
You said that one was good, but you would say Eternal Sunshine's a tier above it, right?
yeah, I would say like Eternal Sunshine in my eye is like the pinnacle of filmmaking. And you can fight me on this in the comments if you want to, but this is probably like on my Mount Rushmore of films for sure.
It is for me as well.
Yeah. But it's like for me what really gets me though is like this film is just like an emotional roller coaster from start to finish, right? Like
Mhm.
you for me, I've always loved films that make me feel, right? Because it's like one of those things where, yeah, you can go to a film, you can go for escapism, you can go see a fucking action film and, like, just don't worry about plot, don't worry about any of that bullshit. you just want to watch something to be entertained, right?
Hmm.
I feel like with a film like this, you go into it, and you're going. Obviously, like the point of the film is to be entertaining, right? But I feel like the best films I've seen are films that have something to say it very effectively, and also go about it in a way that makes you think about things a little bit differently coming out of it. And
Hmm.
I
I
think,
totally agree.
yeah, and I think Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind does that, like, very effectively, you know?
I totally agree with you on how potent and emotional punch it has.
Hmm.
But I think another part of Eternal Sunshine that also is very impressive is how we've talked about the emotional human element of it and how masterful it is.
Yeah.
But the sci-fi cerebral element is also like unparalleled. When we brought up Inception, Inception is a really groundbreaking, cool film,
Hmm.
but the ways they talk about memory and dreaming are like much more overt and much more crude. And I think there's a lot of very subtle things that Eternal Sunshine does, especially in the dream sequences in Joel's mind, that I was unbelievably impressed by. Like it really captures how kind of weird and uneven memories and dreams are, and how they kind of fuse together in very strange ways. And a lot of it was like excellent camera work and set design, but like the kind of scenes where Joel's in his mind and he's going from like different rooms in different locations
Hmm.
and like you know time periods that span across decades
Yeah.
and are in different parts of the country are like lined up together, but it still feels supernatural. Um, the way that the memories bleed together,
Yeah.
like some elements of a different memories enter and leak into newer memories, like the sand in the water being in a lot of the like non-beach scenes,
Hmm.
and like certain objects like the vacation house and certain things from Joel's house or Clem's house or her car like sneaking into the backgrounds. Like
Yeah.
it really feels super fluid in a way that like I don't think Inception was ever that sort of subtle. And I think that's another part of this film that I really like is it captures not just the big strokes of dreams and memories, but the subtlety. The last two things I'll say is
Sure.
there's a sequence kind of in the middle of the operation where Joel is going back into his childhood, and that's my favorite part of the operation storyline, where like Joel keeps switching from being like a child to being a teenager to being an adult, and like his clothing is changing and the dialogue and how mature it is changing and his
Hmm.
mannerisms are changing, but also like the camera work is moving all the time, and it's incredibly effective at having him like kind of oscillate between being a child and being an adult, and like really capturing um like the fusion of all these memories that are just from different times in his life. And
Hmm.
then lastly, I mean, um as the operation is happening in Joel's and his memories, the memory erasures, they start very subtle
Hmm.
and they're almost cleansing. Like things disappear quietly in the background and it's in white. But then as Joel's mind state changes and he becomes panicked and he realizes the operation is actually negative, like the editing and the objects and people vanishing, it becomes much more jagged and it becomes much more overt and ugly. And as the operation continues, there's this kind of subtle effect of like um, the memories that Joel has. Um, there's fewer and fewer details. The sets are less real, and they become more grainy and abstract. And I think it was just a masterful, subtle sort of capturing of, I think, one of the most complicated sci-fi concepts to really master, not only in film but like in books, which is just like how do you make memories and dreams feel real? And this film did, I think, an unparalleled job at doing that as well.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, when we talked about this and like looked up some facts about it, one of the things I think you told me was that Kaufman, it took him like 3 years to write this script, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it took like 2 years to like fully produce it, like get everything put together. So in all, it took like half a decade just to make this film.
And
Um,
yet you can tell, I mean, the love, the details, like it all paid off in the end.
yeah, no, it 100% did. And I think what really strikes me about it too is like there's it's one of those films where you could talk about it for a long time just because and there's so many different ways you can analyze it and look at it, and that's actually a good way to segue into talking about the themes here too. um
Do you want to talk about the story structure before we do that?
um like specifically like the past or the present going into the past then present, or are you thinking of something different?
Yeah, yeah, that, because we didn't put it in the summary the way that the film is non-linear and how it's presented, but I thought you wanted to break that down a little bit.
Yeah, I could talk about it a little bit. So essentially, like the story starts in our present. So, uh, basically, what's happened is Joel has, had his memory wiped, from the previous night. Goes to Montauk because apparently, and you learn about this later in the film. Clem in the memory basically says, "Hey, go to Montauk," or meet me in Montauk, um, which I've always been curious about, and I'd like to get your opinion on this because I've been thinking about this for the past couple days, just since watching this film. Um, in terms of like having the memory erased of Clem, right? How would he know why to go to Montauk? And
We'll
also,
we'll get into this in the themes, but
in
I have a bunch of ideas. I thought that was also super interesting.
okay, because I'm curious to like hear your thoughts of why Clem also ended up in Montauk in that. Okay.
Mhm.
But so to get back to what I was talking about, so in the after the memory wipe, Clem and Joel meet again, unbeknownst to them, and they hit it off, everything like that. Then at one point we do switch back to the past to like showcase these sort of things that had happened, with the B plot and everything like that. And then at some point, once we see Mary's discontentment with Howard, and her releasing all the sort of tapes to everyone, we then see Clem pick up the tape that was mailed to her apartment, plays it on the cassette player, and then they find out the truth. So
Mhm.
that basically bridges like the present and the past together to like hit the full sequence, which I thought.
And this nonlinear structure, especially with the added plot of the operation itself and how
Mhm.
weirdly time works in Joel's brain. I mean, this is again like we're talking about how the ensemble is a really difficult thing to master, how the balance between emotional and cerebral is a really hard thing to master. Like having this very non-linear kind of strange structure to your story is another like kind of eternal sunshine ball that it's trying to juggle that's really complicated. But I think it really works. I think it captures kind of the sense of instability and messiness in breakups. And there's a lot of weird things that don't really make sense in the kind of beginning, middle part of the film, like kind of inconsistencies in the way that Joel kind of behaves and Clem behaves,
Mhm.
and like their confusion at some of their own actions, and like little things in the background, like missing journal entries and inconsistencies between different scenes. And later you'll learn that these are all kind of evidences of like the operation and like the things that Joel and Clem don't know yet. But like I thought it was I thought it really dovetailed nicely. And like
Yeah.
it was a source of tension, the nonlinear kind of inconsistent unreliable element of the story. Um, and then it leads really nicely into kind of the plot twists and kind of ends up being a bunch of very clever spoilers.
Yeah, and it's one of those ones that I think, sometimes a movie will use non-linear narrative in a way that's like more distracting than it's worth it. But I think
Mm-hmm.
like for this film in particular, you kind of have to use that sort of narrative there.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree.
So another thing, is that kind of the main talking points we want to go before we go into the themes, or is there anything else
Yeah, I
you want
think
to
so.
add? Okay. So, first off, like, I think the main thing we need to talk about when we're talking about the themes is the importance of failure and grief and growth. How important those elements are to the backbone of a relationship, right? Um, so a lot of like most relationships we have in our lives end in failure, right? Like they're not
Mm-hmm.
successful, they don't like fully fledge out, you know. And that's fine because that leads to that growth and that sort of learning and understanding. And I think it's very interesting because this film is all about trying to mitigate that, right? Get rid of
Mm-hmm.
all those bad feelings and those bad memories so that we don't have to cope and grow and deal with those things. And
And
I,
you can see this in the three main characters who had the operation. I mean, Clem's problems, the thing that destroys her relationship with Joel, is her lack of self awareness, her impulsivity, and like her sense of escapism. And those are the things that continue because she never learns her lesson from her breakup of Joel. And she continues to do these things and be erratic and kind of undateable. And then, Mary falling in love with Howard was also because she never addressed the problems that led to her falling in love with Howard in the first place. The fact she deals with her own depression and loneliness by romanticizing everything, romanticizing her boss, romanticizing her job, romanticizing her workplace, and then of course with Joel, he loses Clem because of his own insecurities that cause him to be passive and not to initiate, not to really fight for her. And when he forgets about Clem, I mean, he's really in a depressive rut and he just hasn't been able to evolve in his life because he's never really had to confront his fundamental issues.
yeah, and it's one of those things where I think I remember hearing like a quote about it, right? Uh, is it is it better to have
Tennyson, is it better to have loved or lost than to have never loved at all?
yes, yeah, and it's one of those things where that's quintessentially like what the plot hits on, right? Like, is it is it a good thing to have moved on or to have these sort of things and grow from these things? Or would it have been better if it had never happened in the first place, right? And I think the ultimate answer to this question that the film provides us with is that in order to be fully functioning adults and in order to be fully functioning human beings in this world who function and try and become better, we need to have those hurts in our lives. We need to have those pains, and we can't forget them. We need to be able to sit within them, understand them, not wallow in them, but to grow from them.
I totally agree. I think the other really important theme that's positive, at least in this film, is like the transformative power of relationships.
Yeah.
And I think you can see this particularly with Joel's sort of memories as he's living through the operation, where he manifests Clem, particularly in his childhood, where
Hmm.
Clem literally serves as this sort of surrogate figure who overwrites a lot of his like shameful memories and like makes him learn a different lesson when he's kind of early in his childhood and his mom is sort of neglectful. Like Clem enters those memories and she supports him and she gives him attention and she sort of allows him to get over those sort of insecurities. And then later, when he's being bullied,
Hmm.
Clem is also there in his memories, and she sort of convinces him that he cares too much about what other people think, and
Yeah.
he has to sort of be in his own mind. And I mean, she's literally in the operation. She's literally like having him relearn lessons that like shaped him across his life. And I think in a larger sense, I mean, like Joel's personality and sort of his natural tendency is that he's a very passive, sort of traditional, conventional guy. And I think you can see Clem's influence as well in the way that he fights the operation, because the way that he attempts to avoid having his memories erased, like going into different dreams that aren't related to Clem, hiding kind of Clem in parts of his memories that aren't supposed to be there,
Hmm.
like doing all these things to try and be awake. I mean, he's really seizing his own destiny, and he's doing the things that Clem taught him to do. He's brave, he's unconventional, he's aggressive, he's fearless. So I think like a lot of the dreamscape operation, really it's a massive indicator of just how powerful Clem is in Joel's life, and in a fundamental philosophical sense, how powerful our most important romantic and interpersonal relationships are in our lives.
Yeah, and it's one of those ones where what interests me about like Clem being a big part of that sort of lesson learning sort of plot device there is that it is the best version of Clem that he imagines within his head, right? Like it
Mm-hmm.
is the things that he admires the most about Clem guiding him through these points, right? Not the memories we see in the later stages where it's always them fighting or having these arguments in public. It's the version he saw when he met her and spontaneously went with her on that frozen lake and sat there with her,
Mm-hmm.
right? It and it's so funny to see how the memories of people can be like very different from how those people play out in real life, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
because you get you. I think a lot of times we tend to romanticize the relationships we carry, but we also tend to romanticize like the qualities in partners as well as like even friendships. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think we tend to think about how good these things are, good these things feel, but we never really stop and think like, what are the things that like are not okay here, or like, but what I really love is like this whole sort of thing in his mind happens, and he comes to like that realization of like, you know, I can be a better person, I can improve, I can work on myself even more. And that's what makes it so fascinating when he meets Clem again, because it's like they're meeting for the first time, but they're even from that moment two very different people from the first time they met, uh, you know, at the start of their beginning of their actual relationship.
Yeah, I think both those points are really interesting. For your first point about how like our memories of people are often very different from who they really are objectively. I
Hmm.
mean, I think this goes into kind of one of the larger sort of narratives of this film, which is um, how manipulable and sort of non-objective memory is in general,
Yeah.
and you know how easy it is, even outside of the operation itself, to sort of distort or shift or sort of like alter your perception or reading of reality and the different people in your life. And then I think on your second point, I think this goes back into kind of the thing that I wanted to talk about later, where you were talking about like why Joel goes to Montauk,
Yeah.
and also like why Joel is more impulsive after the operation and restless, and why Clem is so much more kind of self-aware and honest. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things about the operation is that it's totally full of shit. It's not just that the operation like will stop you from being able to grow as a person
Hmm.
and fundamentally complete yourself and be happy. It's also that like removing the memories themselves of the person is not enough to erase their impact on you.
Yeah.
to erase the relationship.
Yeah.
There are all of these sort of subtle influences in your life that's caused by your partners. And I think
Mhm.
you can see this most with um, Clem's relationship with Joel's memories of childhood.
Yeah.
Even if you erase Clem completely and all the memories that Clem's in, Clem has changed Joel's perspective on his childhood and the way that he interprets the events in his childhood. So in the end, I mean, it does weaken him to erase her, but even erasing her fully is not enough to really stop the effect that she's had on his life. And Joel's effect on Clem is similarly powerful. And similarly, the operation fundamentally fails in its attempt to revert her to a pre relationship version of herself.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where I always wonder, like, what it was like on Clementine's part on the other end, right? Was Clem also having this sort of thing with Joel, where she was seeing parts of herself and, like, reflecting with him as well and coming to similar conclusions? Uh, it's something to think about, I think. And it's one of those things where it's really interesting that we only get Joel's perspective on it and never really get the full perspective of like Clem's transition through it as well.
In a sense, that is the point of the film, right? That
Hmm.
like it almost doesn't matter what Clem's experience in the operation is because to Joel, like he'll never know. All Joel knows is his idealized version of Clementine and
Yeah,
how she affected his life. And so, you know, it's almost irrelevant what actually happened with Clem to Joel in terms of the way he perceives her and the way he values her and the way that he frames her in his life.
yeah. It's I think it's one of those things where it's quite interesting to see this play out, and even the ending is one of those ones. And we'll talk about this here in a sec. But it's one of those ones where you don't really know how it's going to play out in the end, right? Will they succumb to their same sort of, faults and weaknesses within themselves, or will this experience have strengthened them and strengthened their relationship in turn? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's one of those ones where, you know, I I really love a film that just like lets the audience decide and take their own like sort of interpretation into effect, right? That's why
Mm-hmm.
when we at some point I hope we get to watch The Thing and just talk about like interpretation and that sort of thing, but that's for a different conversation. But like um it's one of those things where I think what a really great film will do is say, "Hey audience, here's my concept. Here is the thing I want to showcase." And let them sort of fill in the blanks they need to fill in, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's shown that Joel's mom is like purposely like or maliciously neglectful, right? It's kind of showcased in the fact that this child is left unattended for a lot of times, and the sitter is given instructions to like kind of deal with him while she's off doing her own thing or drinking or smoking, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think there's really ever discussion of a father in the picture. So it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
just him and his mother, presumably. But it's one of those things where you watch through that film and you're given so much but not enough to like really be spoon fed.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this ties again to sort of the subjectiveness of memories and the malleableness of memories. Like it, in a sense, it doesn't really matter
Hmm.
what actually happened in Joel's childhood and who his mother was and who his father is. Like all that matters for Joel is the way he perceives them and the way he remembers them and the way that he perceives their relationship and how those things ultimately shape the way that he interacts with every other human being across his life, really.
Yeah, so I guess with all that being said, are there other things you want to hit on as it relates to themes, or what else are you thinking?
So it was interesting. I think I've won you over a little bit, but um, before we watched the film, you said that one of the weaknesses of the film was the B plot, in particular, Mary, the
Yeah, I did.
secretary.
I did say that. Yeah.
And I had a very different perspective on it. I actually thought the B plot was really interesting and essential. And the reason that I thought that is, like, initially, the operation team is sort of a contrast to Joel. He's like kind of an emotional, erratic mess, and they are presented as these objective, rational, unemotional, sort of clinical professionals. But like that appearance collapses during the operation
Yeah.
when he's not watching them.
Yeah.
I mean, they engage in sex, they engage in like espionage, they steal from him, they eat his food, they drink his alcohol, they do a lot of hard drugs. Like they demonstrate themselves to be callous, flawed, incompetent, irrational, lustful. I mean, they're really all of the seven sins. And then, of course, at the end, like Mary really destroys the image of the team as um, you know, not like their patients by sending all the patients their files, and kind of destroying the entire operation. And the reason why I think that's a really important B plot is I think it shows that it's impossible to be kind of objective and clinical and rational in the way that you perceive memories and relationships. That those things are so deeply emotional, are so deeply subjective, are so deeply influential that it's impossible for you to be a true professional when just dealing with all of that emotion and all of that power and all that sense of identity. And it's of course the team totally cracks and falls apart um, in that on that night. And of course the team is ultimately doomed and their business model is doomed. And so I think that's a really important point as well.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where when I originally watched this, right, I was kind of always I wasn't really the thing that struck me about the B plot wasn't the lack of necessity for it. I think when we had this discussion, I was not as impressed with the acting of it. I feel like that was what my contention was. And while watching it again, this however many times I've seen it at this point, I will say like it is better than I thought it was. Um, I think I just took issue with like some of the acting choices there because I think the thing is Kate Winslet and Jim Carrey kind of knock it out of the park, and it just kind of falls flat in comparison. I think.
I I would disagree. I think the most
Interesting.
impressive actor in the B plot is actually Howard, the head doctor, who, you know, um, he's the last of the team to
Mhm.
really demonstrate that like you can't be a professional when dealing with memories
Yeah.
and grief. And in many ways, he's one of the worst people morally on the team. I mean, sort of engaging in that affair with like Mary, who's young and impressionable, and obviously kind of not um, really the most adult or responsible person. And then instead of sending her away, he, it's implied, kind of manipulates her into doing the operation.
Yeah.
And then he keeps her in the office anyway, like despite the fact that he knows it's all going to happen again. But I think he's a really interesting um, character and also kind of a performance because I think it's the most subtle performance in the film where he's sort of he's presented as kind of this gentle, kindly, but also very kind of rock solid and kind of rational figure. And
Hmm.
then as the operation starts to fall apart and the other people start to kind of do bad things on the team, and then eventually when it's revealed kind of what an enormous piece of shit he is and how he's literally using his technology and scientist sort of pedigree in
Yeah.
order to prey on this woman
Yeah.
like and I think when these reveals happen, like it's quite subtle, and I think you still empathize with him, and you kind of, I don't know, like the cracks of his character are just
Yeah.
much more slow burn, and I think much more resonant.
Yeah,
Um,
I will say, like, the only person I don't think you can really empathize with is Patrick. I don't know, dude. Like, he just seems like a total piece of shit. You know what I mean? Like, um, but yeah, I mean, so another thing, there aren't many other things I was thinking about themes wise. What else? Is there anything else that comes to mind before we move on, or
I think that's all the ones that I was interested in.
okay? So I guess the last thing we have to talk about is, so do you view the film, like, speaking wise, do you view the film as like a tragic piece or more of an optimistic piece as a whole?
So I think I'm mixed because I think you can interpret it two ways, and I think it depends on the way you perceive memory in this film. If you perceive memory as being fatalistic, if you think that the erasing of Clem or Joel from their memories, that will kind of destroy their ability to grow as people, then the film is fundamentally tragic
Hmm.
because without why because they did the operation, their relationship is going to fall apart because they're the same people and they haven't learned from their mistakes. But I think if you perceive memory as being more powerful and kind of being beyond the memory, or sorry, relationships as being more powerful and being beyond the memories themselves, then even with the operation, I mean, there's still hope that the residual influences of them in their lives, even if they can't remember themselves in a literal sense, that they still have like a fighting chance. So I think that really depends on that.
I mean, like, from your own perspective, which way would you lean, do you think?
I think so. One of the kind of interesting arguments that I would make, one of the one of the more interesting points that I think is made in it is Clem repeats herself at different points in the film. She has a couple lines
Hmm.
where she says the same thing, but they have wildly different contexts. Like the one that I really remember is it's like a line of like, like I'm a super fucked up girl, and like all I'm looking for is like an escape or something like that.
Yeah,
And the first time she says it in the film, she means it. She means it literally.
yeah,
Like it's not a self-aware thing that she says. It's a thing that she says in an like she actually is framing herself as kind of this like manic pixie dream girl that
yeah,
needs to be saved. And then at the very end of the film, when she and Joel meet again, she says it ironically. And it's very kind of apparent that she's self aware of the fact that that's not really true
yeah,
and that that's not really what she wants in her life.
yeah.
And so I think that shows um, that they have changed in spite of the operation. In many ways, they will do the same things and say the same things,
Mm.
but the meaning behind it and who the people are behind those words, that I think has changed. And that I think gives them hope.
Yeah, I tend to view this film specifically as like sort of the ultimate optimist, romantic film. Even though it's deals with the messiness and the objectively just harsh reality of what a relationship could look like. Um, I think ultimately it's about how we grow into people, right? And in this case, growing with your partner, sure, but there's also growth outside of it, right? Like, it doesn't, not in the film's messaging in particular, but in general, I would say, it's one of those things where you need to have these experiences, these forms of hardship to really grow and to really objectively uh, see yourself becoming that sort of better version of yourself. I will say it's one of those films that I do truly believe is uh, something that I think everyone should watch and really, uh, not only once, but like it's a film you could watch a couple times to really get to the heart of it. But I think it's ultimately one that showcases um, what love for another person can look like, right?
Well, to go back to your point before you continue about
Sure.
growing on your own,
Hmm.
I think the person who demonstrates this actually the most strongly is Mary, where when
Yes.
she and
Yeah.
Howard are interacting, there's a couple points in the film where Howard is surprised by things that Mary says and does. And the one that I think is most iconic is Mary is reading out these quotes that she really likes to Howard. And the first quote, Howard knows already. And we later learn that the reason he probably knows it is because they had a relationship.
Hmm.
But then she gives a second quote that has a very different meaning in some ways from the first quote. And Howard is surprised. He hasn't heard that quote and he's struck by it. And I think that really shows that effect as well. That, like, even with Howard erasing Mary's memories, like, he can't really stop her from living her life. And so she continues to read, she continues to learn, and she continues to surprise him even without him being in her life as an influence.
Yeah, and I think when Mary goes off at the end of the film, right, that's the ultimate thing of like, growth outside of the relationship, right? Growth
Very
by,
interesting point, yeah.
yeah, growth by moving on. Um,
I never thought about that. That
yeah.
in her original version, she is passive and she stays in the company and she allows the operation to happen. And then
Hmm.
at the end, I mean, in a sense, her leaving and giving all of the tapes to the patients, I mean, she's really the character in the film who grows the most.
Yeah, and has the
Yeah.
most influence, I think, over the course of the events, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess this is kind of a good time to like kind of rate the film, talk about it. We both have like these 10-point systems. This is objectively a 10 out of 10 for me. Like it is one of the few 10 out of 10s I have on my radar. Uh, it's just, I mean, we've talked for this about this film for an hour, so it just goes to show you like how much we do enjoy it. But Fowler, what are your final thoughts or like things you want to really talk about here?
I agree that it's a 10 out of 10 film.
Yeah.
I was really thinking as I was doing notes for this review, like, is there anything in this film that I would change? And I think if you really put a gun to my head, maybe I would remove Patrick and Stan as characters, and I would just have Mary and Howard be the B team. But I mean, um, I think it's a really masterful film. I've talked before about like how there are films that are incredibly ambitious and they have a lot to say and they do a lot of interesting things, but ultimately they're raw and they're not particularly polished or refined as products. There's a lot of plot holes, there's a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Um, and this is not a film that does that. This is a film that is unbelievably detailed, unbelievably subtle, unbelievably refined. I'm really struck by just all the little details in this film that like a lesser film wouldn't do, and how like powerful and immersive it becomes because all of these little details are woven into it, and it's just so it just sucks you in. It's such a powerful film. I think the only film I've ever seen that comes close to this level of polish in terms of like kind of the psychological thriller is maybe Shutter Island. Um, but I think Shutter Island is also a 10 out of 10 like masterpiece film.
Yeah. I mean, it's very rare that I look at a film like, this is the first film I think we've sat down and it is just like hard to find like a weak point in it, right? Like
Mhm.
gun to your head, probably right on my front as well. I'd probably agree with getting rid of Stan and Patrick. But like really like there's not a lot to dislike about this film, I think.
Mhm.
Um so yeah, I mean, any final thoughts, things you wanna like discuss before we call it, or?
The next film has a hell of a fucking
Oh,
ledge to
dude,
climb up.
I do not envy the position the next film has because, coming off this, it's gonna be a tough stretch for sure.
We're gonna do the randomizer. It's gonna be like School of Rock or like Tusk.
Dude, I swear to God, at some point it will be something where we're both like genuinely like, why the fuck did we watch this? Like, but yeah. So yeah, that's gonna do it from us though. Thank you guys so much for watching and subscribing. Yeah, just let us know what you thought as well. If you've seen the film, just feel free to add something in the comments. And other than that, y'all have a great rest of your day and talk to y'all soon. Have a good one.